complexion. As a friend told me, at my complexion you go from matte to gloss. So that's my version of it. So I'm not usually this husky. It's just because I got a bit of a cold. I'm going to try my best to get through this. So this little story that I'm about to tell you guys is more orientated towards the students in the crowd. I think that this is something that I would like to provoke in you in terms of how to pursue your careers and how to keep an open mind and a curiosity. And I'm hoping through the last few years since I graduated that I could provide some sort of insight as to what you may encounter out in the real world. So briefly, I graduated from UCT and some of my mentors are still in this room, which is good to see. And subsequent to that, I worked in practices in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and then did an urban design course in London, which further brought my understanding into spatial practice into a lot more clarity. While one is in a state of confusion and trying to make sense of what to do and how to do while I was traveling, I felt that one of the best ways to engage more meaningfully is to start a studio. So while I was traveling, this is a diagram, while I was in Cuba, I was trying to make sense of the things that I thought that was important to me and how they could potentially arrange themselves and be dynamic to a terrain that I'm still not familiar with. So a studio is an important part of a tool in terms of trying to understand a particular place. We're based in Johannesburg, and this is one of the early studios that we're in. And it's usually quite a chaotic place with students around, lots of things being cut and pasted. And I like to treat it as my very precious desk that I had at UCT. So I like to see it as a complete mess all the time. So one of the early things that I got confronted with while in practice was an example in Soweto, where we were involved in a public environment upgrade, and what really struck me was the type of conversations that take place on the street between visitors and people and residents in there. And that was something I was trying to exploit in some way within this tourist precinct. So what you see behind here is a house, and at this house there was a lady that I often contacted while I was on site, and I really appreciated that she took a living room chair and sat on the balcony out there, and she would chat to people out there. And I said, ma'am, I really like what you're doing and how you socialize with the public at large. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can arrange that our budget and our infrastructure, such as a bench, comes towards you. So we decided to put a bench directly out to her, and we got her to choose the colors that she'd like on there, which is the black, green, and white. And we put the bench out there, and immediately thereafter, she put up a boundary wall outside her. And it confused and perplexed me completely, because previously she didn't have any boundary wall. It was one of the few houses in Vilakazi Street that didn't have a boundary wall. And it made me believe that there's some things that we do as architects that may not always be right, and I felt that we always needed to remain curious and try to make sense as to what on earth, how do we best relate to the people that we work for and the built environment. So what I'd like to present to you today is three ways or three sort of strategies or methodologies that I have adopted to help me guide me through my practice. And thereafter, I'd like to demonstrate through three projects how valuable this could be, and it's for you to judge whether it could be valuable or not. So one of the texts that really inspired me was something by Caroline Kiato, which states, as you can see on the screen, African urbanists need to find a new language. Need to find new languages, methodologies, and conceptual tools for understanding African cities as an analytical category in their own right, not just as a deviant form of existence. And what that compels me to want to do is try to immerse and engage myself in the urban spaces as they unfold in Johannesburg in this case. So here are the three methods that I think are relevant for the way we've adopted our practice. I find that the city of Johannesburg, with its survivalist tendencies, does bring about quite an urgent need of how people feel that their spaces should be arranged. And what I like seeing out here are things like how the city and the inhabitants communicate, and I'm urging architects and spatial practitioners to have a more keen eye as to what happens in the built environment, and to develop, and basically cities talk to you. It's a matter of trying to understand that language and try to let that be part of your vocabulary as a spatial practitioner. So there's things like confusion, survival, resourcefulness, and communication that becomes important for us. You'll see that the image on your top left, which is this idea of desperation, where people live within the infrastructure of the city, such as the crevices and the holes under bridges, where we put public benches in the street that doesn't get used for sitting on, but for surveillance by the shops immediately outside. And you start you start asking yourself, why do bus stops, which are designed quite fantastically from the 70s, aren't used? So there are things that becomes quite obvious that some parts of our city just do not work. I'm keen to understand why don't they work and try to let our design responses to be a little bit more considered to the sort of political, social and economic climate that we're in. And one of the second sort of resources that I feel that's important to have is to reference heroes. And that, for me, I'm looking at who are the people that you think in their own practices has best demonstrated a set of values and criteria that you can best use as some sort of theoretical crutches in the way you deal with your practice. And who I really enjoy is the Situationist International, and in particular Constant Neverhes in his project New Babylon. But the details of that is for another talk. And inspired by the situation is what we do in downtown Johannesburg is for us to try to understand the inner city, we do these experimental walks. So I'm trying to understand the unique geographies of a particular neighborhood or part of the city that's not passed on to me by the way the administration carves out the city. So what we would do, again inspired by the Situationists, is this idea of a derive. So in this example, we'd follow someone with a red shirt, and we'd follow this individual until they either became suspicious or they went out of our sight, and then we'd wait until we found another person. And what that does is it starts taking you on parts of the city that's beyond your familiar geography, and it starts letting you understand things that you really didn't understand before. So this is the map there on the right-hand side is the consequence of what one of those journeys did, and we tried to put together cities that felt the same in terms of atmospheres versus in terms of convenient administrative segments. And through that, what we would do is, when we do these walks, it's a very quick 60-minute walk where we walk with cameras in a group of about 6 people, and we will capture the visual imagery that we see around us. And it's important that we take the imagery that we see from the city that's familiar with us, and we go back to the studio, and within another 60 minutes we cut, and we do, through the process of collage, we reimagine what the particular sites are, projecting either a utopian or a dystopian image of what that city is. And we feel that's an important way of finding alternative imaginaries for our cities in a vocabulary, a spatial vocabulary that is familiar and not something that's important. The third, well, and obviously we do lots of these things. So I often do lots of these with the Philippus class and Alex Opper's class in the University of Johannesburg, and with the VIT students. And so if those are the 3 sort of guides or methods in the way one could practice, I'd like to just show you how one goes about trying to unearth and trying to make sense of some of the the specialness, okay? The specialness within some of our urban conditions. So here's 3 projects that I think kind of guides us and assists us as architects about some of the new spatial scenarios and conditions that come up. The first one is a Shabin study that we did with sociologists in Cape Town. It's the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, and they were basically asking, can you help us? We need architects, basically visual scribes, to help us communicate in a more articulate way some of the issues facing Shabins within the Cape Town townships. So currently, this is a picture of a Shabin in Philippi, and the current Western Cape Liquor Act is trying to illegalize the Shabins that's currently in there, and they're asking that all liquor needs to be consumed on a high street. And what that does is it immediately compromises the livelihoods of people who are marginalized. So we felt we needed to play some sort of role in terms of sensitizing government and the health authorities about how complex the Shabin is. And yes, it does have some social ills to it, but surely it plays a more significant role within certain communities. So the site is it's an informal settlement in Philippi, and what you see out there for a population of about 17,000 people, you've got about 109 Shabins in there. They don't take on any particular spatial arrangement. They're kind of evenly distributed through that area, and we were trying to find what sort of patterns there are. When we presented this information to the health department at the Western Cape Health Department, we obviously couldn't pinpoint every single dot with accuracy, because there's fear of victimization that the health authorities would find this is quite a convenient tool. Let's go and shut each one of those things down. So what you're seeing there is a slight adjustment. We've basically panned some of the dots so that we don't expose some of the shebeen owners. So with the shebeen operators, we felt that their stories would be an important way to access how the shebeens are structured and configured. This is a shebeen owned by Ruby. Ruby's on the bottom right-hand side out there. And what we would do is basically for 5 days we would practically live on the site, except for stay there in the evenings, except for a Saturday night where we stay quite late at a shebeen. But what we tried to do was try to extract some of the nuances about how these spaces are configured. So through photographic documentation, like you see out there, we annotated how the entrances work, how the thresholds work, how security is managed within these areas, and how adaptable they are. So what you see at the bottom left is the exterior yard at the back of the shebeen, and the front there is 2 doorways. One is to Ruby's house itself, and the back one is into the shebeen itself. And we were interested in how the private space of the shebeen entrepreneur and how the private space and the shebeen space basically coexisted. To help us with that, we did a series of drawings. We identified about 6 different shebeen types where we documented through drawings and photography. And what you see on the bottom left-hand side there is the basic arrangement of the public and private spaces within the shebeen. The shaded line is the shebeen itself, and the rest of it, the support spaces, is the private space. What becomes really significant for us is how does in this particular shebeen, you'll find that the entranceway is on the bottom right-hand side. So that's the basic, that's the shebeen space out here. What was important for us to map was the amount of people that was in there at a particular time. You find things like the furniture that's in there, the way openings are made from the kitchen and the bedroom are important ways in how the space is surveilled and how it's been used. We were interested in the sort of micro enterprises that are supported by the shebeen. So you'll find that there's a backyard dwelling out here. There's the neighbor that's selling meat, and across the street that there's meat being sold. So there was an interesting microeconomy that was taking place around that area. There was also an interesting recycling initiative that the broken bottle, the bottles and the plastic bottles were kept and collected by someone else later. And these were important facts that we needed to communicate to the local economic development department within the Western Cape government. What you see on the bottom here is the insides of the shebeens. The top one is showing where the actual shebeen itself. The bottom one is Ruby's private bedroom. Through the private bedroom, she's got a hatch in there. And that hatch is that if she's not feeling well, the shebeen can still run and she can still earn an income. So she basically pulled the curtain away and still serve people. The music is a very important controlling device in terms of how to regulate the tempo of the shebeen. And an interesting reaction that we'd like to point out to the health department particularly is that there's a tremendous amount of fights and conflict that takes place when one is inebriated. So what the owner of this, Ruby's husband, basically did here is that one of the key reasons why fights break out is because alcohol that is left on the floor in the glass is tipped over by someone else, and that breaks out into a big fight. So what he does is he creates a ledge, and that has dropped the amount of fights that break out in shebeens, which has also dropped the amount of times that the police come in there, and it has provided some form of resilience for her. Things that make the shebeen particularly different are some of the furniture and the components within them. So if you have a TV, or if you have a urinal close by, or if you have a pool table, all of these things influence the way these spaces perform, and they lend a level of differentiation to it. So what we tried to do was try to identify what exactly makes them different. So we created something of an anatomy diagram where we showed the front of the shebeen. We tried to see what different patrons, the patronage within the shebeen influences it. Also the amount of alcohol that's sold, that what happened that to avoid being harassed by the cops, you'll stay within a certain threshold because there's a legal limit as to how much of alcohol you can sell, and also the type of alcohol. So if you're selling quarts or if you're selling homemade brews, it all changes the profile of your patrons as well as the profile of your shebeen. Ruby shebeen is what we understand, what we've termed a neighborhood shebeen, because it plays an important civic role within those sites. That she also starts assisting with micro lending, so at the end of the month people would pay her after she lends people money during the month. And with that, with the same logic, we developed the other 5, and some of them would be something like that's the neighborhood shebeen of Ruby, that's the drink-attainment shebeen, that's the one where you basically go, you get trashed and you have a good time. Then there's the conversational shebeen, where you find generally elderly folk going to, and it's almost like something like a tribal council. So there's things like where there's any issues within the community, these are discussed typically by older men, served by women, trying to manage the problems there. But often these are quite passive spaces where the shebeen closes down after 5 o'clock in the evening, and the customers generally go home. There are other ones where there's very little alcohol sold, and this is where the youth are basically looking for a place to go and spend time after work. And this has a pool table which keeps guys entertained. And once we do these studies, what we think is important is to raise awareness about the plight of shebeens and argue that it's quite an important social and civic space within these settings. So we would bring together the police, we'd bring together the health department as well as local government with the shebeen operators to discuss these issues. So again, to the architecture students out there, I think that your role as a practitioner is quite diverse. It's not just about designing buildings, but also trying to see how you play more activist role within certain settings. And as what we were interested in, some of the emergent phenomenon that comes up. One of the examples is this here, which is a urinal. So you find often near the shebeens, there's lots of makeshift urinals, and that's my colleague using one. And we get quite excited about these new ways about mitigating conflict within the area. What you're seeing here, if this comes up, you're seeing on the bottom left-hand side, there's someone basically, the peeing on people's property is quite a big issue. People find it incredibly offensive. So you'll find that often nearby the shebeens, you'll have people saying, please do not pee here in Corsa. So what we decided to do was just let's be anarchic for a moment and guerrilla-like. So we found one of the broken channels within the area. We took that and we converted that into a urinal and created a little drainage system. And that gave us some mild satisfaction in terms of putting something up instead of just drawing all the time. And what we felt was also important was to sensitize people to the fact that they don't need us to come in and do these things. So we were trying to make a point that it's about, if you find an issue within your particular context, look at the materials you have available and the resourcefulness and innovation you have within you to do something. So nearby there was a whole lot of vacant tires at a nearby workshop with guys who can grind it. And what we did is we borrowed some tires, cut them up, created a little pit and a little privacy screen, and that became your urinal outside one of the shebeen owners, and he really appreciated this piece. But the point is, we're trying to say that we don't always need us, but a little bit of innovation and resourcefulness is what one needs, and not necessarily an architect. And another project that helped us understand our particular urban environments is one that was looking at streets. The main point of this exercise was trying to argue to the Gauteng government that the streets are important sites for informal economy and livelihoods. That right now, that the way the bylaws are configured, that you can't actually trade on the streets, that you will be locked up. So we wanted to see if we can influence policy in any way by letting the local government understand that we need to be a little bit more innovative with the way we see bylaws and the idea of developing second economies within the area. We were particularly interested in the space between the private properties and how they were used. So we drew quite a few sections trying to understand how the spaces were appropriated and how their width and the adjacent buildings would influence the way the street was configured. So there's a website for this that you could go on to called emergentcity.co.za. It has more information on it. So what we would do is we typically draw. So we draw the built form of that area. You'll see that that's basically formal housing or formal shops on the side, and you'll have a plethora of micro enterprises on the side that often has a direct relationship to the formal enterprise out here. You'll see that there's interesting power structures that takes place. For example, the taxi rank that's out there, they have a really strong influence about what happens immediately outside their spaces. So they do not encourage they do not encourage any activity along here. So you'll find that the only type of activity that takes place out here is people who use their body as a shop. We also thought that what's important to communicate on the street that in light of the xenophobic climate that we have within our townships since 2008, we also try to argue that the street is one of those really democratic and cosmopolitan sites where you have a range of national backgrounds coming onto the same street and participating in a relatively even way. So what you see out here, each of the different colors represents different nationalities, mostly from Africa, some from Pakistan and Bangladesh. So we try to communicate that in terms of cohesiveness and understanding of the other, the street becomes quite an important site for that for us to understand. And similar to the Shabin project, we wanted to understand what's the basic unit of a particular micro-enterprise, and it related to the actual structure. So we put a huge inventory together about all the different structural types and trading types, and we tried to categorize it in terms of their size. What we tried to do was identify it, draw it in plan, talk about it. We put some performance indicators there about how well they perform, how easy they are to assemble, how vulnerable they are to the Metro Police, etc., and how much of money do they generate based on their capital input. So this is a typical template of one of the trading structures that we have. And we went on to produce quite a few of them in terms of other trading structures varying in different size, and we had little narratives about how they work. There's an example of using your body as a shop, and you'll often have mobile goods where people weren't actually fixed to one place. To help us understand the dynamics of how these objects or these elements worked, we did a series of diagrams such as these, where we wanted to understand within a particular site what is the fiber, be it the social or the physical space that connects and allow these enterprises to exist. So it was about the space that was immediately around it, about the type, how accessible their stores were to the street, whether they were protected. So this particular store is protected, that it's within the taxi rank, so it has certain privileges and rights. So there was and what we also wanted to communicate, that you find that people have structures that seem quite ephemeral, but this structure has been here since 2000. So for 13 years, this lady has been working in this particular site. So we did this for about 12 different types of structural enterprises. This is another example where we talked about the dependency between this particular structure and borrowing infrastructure like electricity and a rental agreement with the person behind you. That with these micro enterprises cannot exist by themselves. They exist because there's a certain layer behind them that props them up. Now, what becomes important for us as architects, before I get there, so through these exercises, what I feel it really helps us as architects understand is about other spatial, building another spatial literacy for ourselves. That we find that in these sites that we research, we often find through survivalist needs that the arrangements are quite honest and explicit, and it provides a very clear reading for us. So what we would then do is extract these through diagrams and let them be the lessons that we need to keep in mind when one practices in any other forum, even for different clients of a different economic standing. So these would be examples about how through different times of the day, different structures occupy different spaces, that they don't occupy the same space all the time. And we were interested in how the subtle negotiations take place. This is an example of the hybridity, where you'd have someone who'd live there, they'll have a little workshop in there, and they'll sell their goods directly on the street. So we wanted to understand what exactly are those sort of new emerging spatial conditions that's coming up, and we felt that some of the sites in Ivory Park that we studied provided a really good insight into that. So this is the third project that I wanted to show you that in terms of helps us see and scratch beyond the surface, where we used photographers within the Ivory Park area and asked them, would you mind being involved in a project called Photo Voice, where we asked them, through their skill as photographers, could you talk to us about what you think is happening within Ivory Park? So it's there using photography as a tool to articulate a voice within the community. So they went out for 30 days and they would post their photographs of street life on a Facebook platform. So we trained the photographers how to use Facebook. We had a huge marketing exercise in a guerrilla way that got people within Ivory Park through the radio stations and subcultures to communicate on this, and we removed ourselves from the equation. So you'll find that photographers will put up some interesting things. Some is where their livelihoods are incredibly compromised, sometimes quite beautiful, and it would start an entire discussion around this. Now, what becomes interesting for us as special practitioners is if we could have probing tools such as these that allows us to understand the aspirations, the needs, and the particular situation of communities, we'd be able to be a little bit more responsive and considered in the way we deal with our infrastructure programs thereafter. So it was an interesting exercise for us. Now, in practice, those projects that I showed you, we did not author. They were authored by the occupants themselves. And it puts us in an interesting situation as architects, because on one hand you need to be an observer, on the other hand you need to act to demonstrate your particular values and make a contribution. So what I'd like to demonstrate now is through three very small projects that we did in the studio recently that kind of argues and supports with this idea about needing to scratch and understand your particular context in a very nuanced way. And I'd like to argue that that kind of brings out a new particular sort of architectural contribution. And here's the project. So on the right hand side, on both these images, what you're seeing is immediately outside a recreation center in Yeovil. The recreation center supported all sorts of social activities like dancing and yoga, and the space immediately outside the recreation center was a park. The park was not underutilized, it wasn't developed, but the users of the recreation center often used the outside space. The city then went and upgraded that park. What they did was they spent a few million rand and they upgraded the park, and it became quite a beautiful public facility. And that on the right hand side is the recreation center. So people would be working outside here. What has happened that there was two different institutions within the city. The one is social development, which owned the recreation center, and the other one is city parks. That if you wanted to go out and rehearse or practice, that you needed to pay 1,000 rand per day to use that space, which sounded ridiculous to us. Like how, and what that meant was that no one started using that space. So we took that on deliberately to be a design challenge or an obsession. So what we did, that's the current arrangement. That was the previous arrangement of the recreation center, the relationship to the park and the fence. And what we were interested in was opening up the front of the recreation center completely, that the inside lobby and courtyard became an extension of the park, and deliberately blurred what was a recreation center and city park space. Through that, we just made an exaggerated threshold that caused a bit of a fight between the two departments. So that means that people within the recreation center felt that I could go onto the private space because there's a structure, into the city park space because there was a structure above us. So what we did was that basically that concrete structure that you see out there is the blue piece out here. So we created this really huge canopy, which is to deliberately create an ambiguity within that. And this is examples of what happens underneath. So it's basically a really large space that people pass through. And there's also a space where the park and the recreation center could overlap. So if the previous example was basically looking at design responses to some of the institutional challenges that we have within our city, this is an example where what I was trying to do was trying to see that in terms of, is it possible that through the way we make space and the objects within space, that it reveals something about our society, and that there's a reciprocity between the way people use space and the way the objects are made. And this is a circular bench. Well, basically it's like a few circles. But the intention behind this bench was that when people occupied the bench, they would choose different parts to sit on. So they would either choose to circulate amongst themselves, or they would look to be by themselves. And the idea for us, or what we imagined happening, was that if you had to take a snapshot of people using that bench, you'd be able to understand how they relate to each other. And that was something that we wanted to draw on. That can architecture, the objects that we make within our cities, assist in how society reveals itself. So this was a bench that was constructed to deliberately show how people relate to each other and what's familiar and common. And this is an example of the bench being the bench executed. There's about 18 of them in Soweto, in Vilakazi Street. And another reaction, and this is the final small project, was that we were asked to, as part of the upgrade project that we do in Johannesburg, one of the most interesting tools that we have, our palette is quite limited. It's basically paving, and it's trees, lighting, and benches. And the benches is the one thing that excites me a lot, because it gives a person an opportunity to dwell and pause within public space. So when we went to the city, we presented them a big bench, and they said, we do not accept a big bench like that because people will sleep on it or sleep under it, so we refused, and we had to go back to the drawing board. And very quickly we went back to the drawing board and we put together a very simple bench. So it's a smaller bench. Second to that when we put these infrastructures up, that we were deliberately told to not pay any attention to the local economy that's out there, because the traders were not organized, they could not be accommodated for. And we felt that that was a huge missed opportunity. So what we did is we mapped out where all the traders are, we mapped out what their basic infrastructure is, and one of the basic components that they have is one of the posts for top. And we basically made the holes for that top as big on the bench, and we argued that that was very important devices to put the bench into place, and the city bought that idea. And then what we did is, like, once we got the bench approved to be a single piece, when we went onto site, we just put them next to each other in that way, and that's how we managed to sneakily get away with of moving from there to there, but just having quite a weird argument. But the point for us is, I really, really enjoy those complexities and those contradictions that come up within the way our briefs are given, and the way what's not being said, is how do you exploit that space and make that design opportunities that, hopefully, when anthropologists do look at our built environment in the future, that they can understand some of the cultural, social and economic situations that we were confronted with at the time. And here's the last image that I have of how those benches are used, and sometimes they become open rooms, and sometimes they're completely appropriated, and what's really interesting is how that they're appropriated beyond what we ever imagined them to be, and how they still supported second economies within these areas. And that's it.